Well, good evening, and thank you very much for joining us for this 2023 Melbourne Law School Queer Lecture. I just said to our distinguished guest that the last time I saw this room as full as it is tonight was the last time he gave a lecture in this room. and so it's hardly surprising to see such a full house. For those who don't know me, my name is Matthew Harding and I'm the Dean of the Law School, and I'm really delighted to be here for this very special event. I'll deliver an acknowledgement of country and then I'm going to hand over to Lara to introduce our speaker. Can I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this law school sits, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations? Can I acknowledge and express gratitude to the traditional owners of that land and to the elders of the Wurundjeri Nation, the knowledge holders of all Indigenous nations and clans who've been instrumental in the journey towards recognition and justice for Indigenous people in our country. I want to recognise the unique place that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, as the original owners and custodians of the lands and waterways across our continent, with histories of continuous connection that date back over 60,000 years. I acknowledge their enduring cultural practices of caring for country, and I pay respect to elders of all Indigenous nations, past, present and future, acknowledging the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. As a community of researchers, teachers, professional staff and students here in our law school, we are privileged to work and learn from Indigenous colleagues and partners. I'm going to hand over to Lara now to introduce our speaker. Thanks, Lara. I'm giving you this seat.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Melbourne Law School for the Queer Annual Lecture 2023. I'm Lara Halprin, a final year Juris Doctor student at the Melbourne Law School and co-director of the Queer Portfolio of the Melbourne University Law Student Society. This year, we have the privilege of hearing the esteemed Honourable Michael Kirby, AC CMG, deliver the Queer Annual Lecture on the topic Queer Liberation 2023. Good news, bad news. Michael Kirby was born and educated in Sydney in public schools and at the University of Sydney. He graduated with a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor of Laws, a Bachelor of Commerce, and Masters of Laws First Class Honours. In 1974, he was appointed Deputy President of the Arbitration Commission and concurrently inaugural Chair of the Australian Law Reform Commission. In 1983, he was appointed a Judge of the Federal Court of Australia. In 1984, President of the New South Wales Court of Appeal and President of the Court of Appeal of the Solomon Islands. His appointment to the High Court of Australia followed in 1996 and lasted until 2009. He has filled positions on many national and international bodies, including as Special Representative on Cambodia and Chair of the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights Violations in North Korea. He served as a member of the World Health Organization's Global Commission on AIDS from 1988 until 1992. He served as President of the International Commission of Jurists in Geneva and co-chair of the IBA Human Rights Institute. Michael Kirby is a patron of Victoria Pride Centre and Qtopia, Sydney's gay museum. He lives in Sydney with his partner, Johan van Vleuten, since 1969, and they married in 2019 on their 50th anniversary. In this lecture, Michael Kirby will review and evaluate developments for LGBTIQ rights and equality. He will discuss the recent good news and recent bad news. The Honourable Michael Kirby will highlight that whilst there have been many successes, they cannot expunge the failures. On a global level, this remains a continuing challenge for human rights, equality and freedom. Please join me in welcoming the Honourable Michael Kirby, AC CMG, tonight.
Like the Dean, I want to start by acknowledging the First Nations people of our country. We're getting better at doing that. in New Zealand it's a very serious matter, and they generally do it with some of the language of the Maori. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. We have got to be as serious about this because we have greater problems than they have in New Zealand, where the Maori stood up to the settlers and secured a treaty and secured many provisions for equality in the law. I also want to acknowledge the presence of the Dean, Professor Matthew Harding. It's a wonderful thing to have him here giving support to this event, and I want to thank all those who are not specifically or identifying as LGBTIQ, not queer, but who are here as friends of justice and equality for all people, because that should be the banner under which all lawyers do their work and ply their trade. In that introduction, which was given to my overlong life of activities in the law, the most precious and important point was left to last. It was the fact of my meeting my partner, Johan, in 1969, and of marrying him after the law was changed in 2019. It was exactly 50 years, and it was exactly to the hour, and it was not far from the place where we met. Lawyers are ever so sentimental, and everything that one does in life, all the achievements and all the glorious offices and all the things that we do for the good of others, is really not as significant to your inner being and to your inner self and your peace with yourself and your feeling of acceptance and love. These things are beyond price, and everybody in this room, straight or gay, knows that. And I therefore want to start with acknowledging my partner, Johan. He's up there in Sydney tonight. He was with me last night in Sydney at a dinner of the Pinnacle Foundation. The Pinnacle Foundation is a body that collects money from extremely wealthy people, many of whom are gay. One of the people there last night was Alan Joyce, who's about to step down from his position as chairman or chief executive of Qantas, and he's a very, very rich person. We are not really so particularly rich, though my partner Johan, being from the Netherlands, was very, very interested in real estate, specifically real estate in Sydney, and specifically real estate with a harbour view. And we've decided that upon the time when we are called to our immortal reward, we are going to give half of our property to our families, our blood families, and we're going to give half of it to charitable causes. People should do that, you know. There are tax advantages in doing it, but it's also the right thing to do. And one of those charitable causes will be the Pinnacle Foundation and the Kirby Institute, which has been established at the University of New South Wales, which works on blood-borne diseases, many of which affect the LGBT community. I urge upon everyone in this room to think about how in due course, when they're all wealthy old lawyers, they can find a space in their hearts to reach out to others who maybe have not had as good an easier journey as they have had. There was the speaker for the scholarship winners last night was a young man named Gavin, and he spoke most tellingly. He's a graduate of this university. He's just graduated in medicine. He had a very difficult time with his family, who were from the subcontinent, and the Pinnacle Foundation stepped in and gave him the funds. He finished his medical degree, and he made a brilliant speech last night. I told him he was a tremendous loss to the Melbourne Law School. He should have been doing law, because he was so eloquent, he was so feeling, and he told his story of suffering and of reigniting his spirit. I wish he were here tonight, but we've got a surprise for you at the end of this lecture by me, and I'll announce what that surprise is a little later. And this is going to be The Law Fights Back, but more of that anon. Now, I said that I would talk about the good news and the bad news. The good news is that the world continues to heed the irrationality of refusing to recognise people who are LGBT plus, and this is happening in so many countries. I mean, it's a remarkable story, especially when you remember that the oppression of queer people began in ancient times, in the ancient scriptures, in Genesis, the book of Genesis and the book of Leviticus. A man who lies with a man as with a woman is guilty of an abomination, and surely shall he be put to death. There are other penalties in the book of Leviticus, and many of them include burning people and punishing them in the most gruesome ways. And unfortunately, that provision was an integral part, it became an integral part of the law of England. And indeed, there have been mentions of it back to the 12th century in the laws of England. And they, under the Tudors, they became part of the criminal law, and they were taken out of the church courts into the king's courts, and there, mercilessly, the punishment was usually death. And more people were hanged in England in 1830 for sodomy, the offence of the Indian and other colonial criminal provisions and of the English common law, than were executed for murder. It's a surprising thing, but it was the reality. A few people raised their voices against it, and particularly after, during the Estates General in France, in the French Revolution, steps were taken to abolish the French law, which was equivalent. And that happened in 1791. The old French criminal law against sexual conduct on the part of same-sex people was abolished. They said, we're not having any of this. This is not rational, and it's gone. Because of that, the French colonies didn't get the law that oppressed queer people in England and its colonies. And because the French didn't oppress their colonies, the German colonies followed, and the Russian state. And ultimately, the more modern communities like Meiji, Japan, and China, and Korea, they did not have the criminal laws against LGBT, but everywhere that the flag of England, the banner of England flew, there were criminal laws against gay people. And we in Australia became a victim of that tradition, and it existed right up to my time at law school. I remember sitting in the class in Law 1, because we studied criminal law in Law 1, and our lecturer was a practitioner. In those days, we didn't have all the learned professors. We had a few, but not many, and most lectures were given by busy practitioners at the end of their day. This lecturer was Mr. Vernon Triet, QC, and I can still remember how he came to the point in analysing the Crimes Act 1900 of New South Wales in section 78, and there was the old sodomy offence, the so-called unnatural offences. And I was sitting in the front row of the Phillip Street Theatre. They were very short of lecture halls in the Sydney Law School, and the Phillip Street Theatre was a very plush place where Barry Humphries performed by night, but Mr. Triet performed by afternoon. And when he came to that point of explaining the sodomy offences, I remember how the feeling of anxiety, and I knew I was colouring because I wondered, does anybody here know? Do any of them realise? Do any of them understand that this is being targeted on me? And sitting in the classroom on the right was my good friend Murray Gleeson, who later became Chief Justice of Australia. And the room was full of future judges and top barristers, just as no doubt this room is tonight. But the story tonight is a story that will ultimately have a happy ending, though that has not yet been achieved. The revision of the criminal law took a long while to reach England, but it ultimately came because of a report of a commission of inquiry chaired by Sir John Wolfenden. He was a university vice-chancellor. He was a very talented and respectable person, and he recommended that the laws of England on homosexuality should be reformed. And we only know years and years and years later that Sir John Wolfenden had a son who was homosexual. But that was not known at the time, and anyway, his recommendations were based mainly on science, the science of what psychologists and others and epidemiologists and others had come up with research. Dr. Kinsey's research at Indiana University was extremely influential, showing that far from being a tiny, insignificant and willful group of people who were doing acts against the course of nature, there were lots of people who were just ordinary citizens, and they were engaging in, for a period of their life, in same-sex sexual activity. And Kinsey drew a scale, and the scale was the Kinsey scale. And the Kinsey scale taught that a certain proportion of people are, right through their life, attracted to their own sex, their own birth sex, and that is virtually immutable. There are others who have periods in their life when they have same-sex attraction, and there are others who have lengthy periods and get married and have children. But there is just this core of people who are just, notwithstanding all the pressures of family and of the criminal law and of society, just LGBTIQ. But back in those days you had to be totally silent, and things did not really change until the Wolfenden Report. It recommended change. Change was achieved in England by legislation, a private member's bill called the Sexual Offences Act, 1967. And that, in the manner of those times, then became to be copied throughout the Commonwealth of Nations. Canada was first, where it was easy, because they had a national criminal code. Then there was New Zealand, then some of the states of Australia started. It started actually in South Australia. South Australia's always been a rather strange and different state. It was all those Germans who went into South Australia, often in fleeing from religious persecution. And anyway, it was a conservative government. It wasn't a Labor, it wasn't Don Dunstan. He came along later and finished the job. But a conservative state began the process of change. And it then went through all the states of Australia successively until 1996-7, when the last state, the Apple Isle, had its laws changed, and nowhere in Australia were the criminal laws criminalising same-sex attracted people. Since that time, the changes that have happened in the world have been extremely promising, and not just in European countries. In the United States, the change was brought about by a decision of the Supreme Court of the United States, first in Lawrence against Texas, in a case before the Supreme Court, and then later in a case called Obergefell, which came before the Supreme Court, which upheld the right of same-sex marriage as guaranteed by the United States Constitution. They're still fighting about these issues in the United States. There are still cases at this very time before the Supreme Court concerning web designers who don't want to design a web for LGBT queer people in case, presumably, they get corrupted by looking at some web designed by a queer person. But the United States achieved a lot. But if you look at US material, they keep saying it was all because of Stonewall. Americans are ever so self-concentrated. They think everything happens in the United States. Well, Kinsey was in the United States, and his impact was far greater than the impact of Stonewall, which was an important step in the United States, but it was the work of Freud, of Kraft Ebig, and of psychiatrists, and of Dr. Kinsey that led to the English statute and that led to the change in England that was copied in Commonwealth countries and other English-speaking countries. Recently, a large number of Commonwealth countries have changed their law, mainly by judicial decision, because after they gained independence, most of them had constitutions which provided for equality. And those equality laws were invoked by people who were queer against the provisions of the local English law based upon the law that we also had in Australia. But one by one, judges in Commonwealth countries began to rule that the criminal law could not stand alongside their constitution. And this was done in Belize, in South America, in Botswana, in Africa, in the Seychelles Islands, and in countries of the Caribbean, although in 3 cases in the Caribbean, a decision of the Privy Council 3 years ago overrode the decision of the local court. The Privy Council was pretty good on death penalty cases, but they have never held in favour of people who have been seeking equality in respect of sexual partners and sexual orientation. They overrode decisions in respect of Bermuda, in respect of the Cayman Islands, and in respect of Trinidad and Tobago. The Privy Council reversed the local judges and reinstituted the criminal laws against gays. But on the whole, you would have to say that the tendency of the last 20 years has been for a lot of courts in the English-speaking world to overrule the constitutional validity of same-sex criminal laws. Probably the greatest of these decisions was a decision which, in a very indirect way, I had something to do with. During the HIV/AIDS pandemic, I was asked by a civil society organisation to go to India and to take part in a series of seminars that they were organised about the most effective way to battle the HIV pandemic, given that there was no vaccine and no cure. We still don't have a vaccine, and we don't have an absolute cure for HIV. We have palliatives, but that led the scientists to consider how can we reverse the epidemic without a cure and without a vaccine. And that led to the position that was adopted in the United Nations, in the World Health Organization, in the Global Commission on AIDS, on which I served, and in the UNDP, United Nations Development Programme. One by one, UN bodies said, if we can't cure or vaccine against HIV, we've got to reach out to queer communities. They didn't use that adjective. We've got to reach out to them in order to ensure that they will listen and they will receive the messages. And Australia, to its great credit, with Dr. Neil Blewett, Minister for Health in the Hawke government, and Professor Peter Boehm, Professor of Public Health and Shadow Minister for the Coalition, they agreed that in Australia we would put HIV above politics and we would reach out to those who are most affected, especially queer people and drug users, injecting drug users, and sex workers, not 3 of the most popular minority groups in the community. So this was what I was brought to India to do, to speak to the judges. And it was a great privilege to go from Madras, a very distinguished High Court. They still call it the Madras High Court because it has a royal charter. The judges of it are appointed under that charter, and it gives them a general jurisdiction to do justice. So they cling on to the old British Royal Charter. Likewise, the Bombay High Court, a very strong court in India, a great commercial hub and a very important court, and the Delhi High Court and other high courts throughout India. We just went the rounds. We called it the caravan. And here were people in civil society in India, and the judges wouldn't have listened to them. But because Justice Edwin Cameron and I were part of the team that was speaking to them, we were listened to and we were given the opportunity. And subsequently, decisions came before Indian courts challenging Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. And there were reversals, but ultimately in 2020, the Supreme Court of India, made up of judges, some of whom had heard the caravan, decided unanimously that the criminal laws against queer people were not compatible with the equality and other provisions, the privacy provisions in the Indian Constitution, and so they were struck down. When that happened, especially after the background of events and reversals and changes that I don't have time to talk about, when that happened, millions of queer people in India had a cloud lifted from their heads, and it was a wonderful thing. The people in civil society who organised these seminars were looking strategically down the track to bring knowledge to the independent judiciary of India, and in the end, that independent branch of government struck down Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. They have before them, reserved for decision, the challenge to the failure of the Indian legislature to provide for marriage equality. So watch this space. But in the big book in the sky, where all my errors are being recorded, but also good contributions, I think the work we did going around from one town to another in little courts and big courts, talking to the judges of India, that I think is one of the most important things that I've done. And Edwin Cameron, who is still the only public office holder in Africa that I know, he was a judge of the Constitutional Court of Africa, of South Africa. He was also HIV positive, and he's open about both of these things, which was an astonishing thing for the Indian judges to hear, but increased the power of his advocacy, and I think had a great effect on the judges of India. And so one by one, countries have changed. Some have held back. The Privy Council turned things backwards in a few countries, but the net result of it was that a lot of good changes have been made, and those changes are continuing. They continue in big ways and little ways. Little ways include the decision in the last few weeks of Iceland and other countries of Scandinavia to ban conversion therapy. All the little package of actions that need to be done to bring true equality for queer people. And the big decisions are decisions striking down the oppression of LGBT people. On the other hand, there have been disappointments. I suppose the biggest disappointment in the current year has been the enactment of the Anti-Homosexuality Act in Uganda. This has a history, but the Act was designed to impose criminal punishment, including to restore the death penalty which had at least been withdrawn during the last period of British colonial rule. We can't keep blaming the British for this because Uganda has been independent for about 60 years. But in the last months, from May, they have introduced new legislation reimposing the death penalty for certain homosexual sexual acts. Likewise, in Brunei, the reintroduction of the criminal penalties. In Singapore, they refused for years. There were so many cases taken to their Court of Appeal to argue. They have a section 377A, which is a copy of the Indian provision, and they were urged do the same thing as the Supreme Court of India has done in the source of this, but the Singapore court refused to do so. Late last year, the government of Singapore announced that they were going to reform the law legislatively, but just to make sure that they weren't becoming wobbly, they said we're going to enact at the same time a constitutional amendment to forbid same-sex marriage. So that has been done. Many countries of Asia have been extremely disappointing on this. Japan, in this year, enacted a law to promote kindness to LGBT people. This is in order to promote understanding of them. But it didn't have to repeal the criminal law because Japan, like other civilian countries, didn't have it. But it fell far short of the same-sex marriage provision. This is the state of the world we now live in. Of course, in many countries, including Malaysia and other countries of our legal tradition, they have not changed their law, and indeed they resist change. There was a pop band that was in the middle of a performance in Malaysia just 2 weeks ago. I think it's called the 1965. It's something that has not really impinged upon my my listening pleasure, but one of the players in the band made a little speech saying he hoped that Malaysia would change the law, and he then rushed down to the front of the band and planted a great big fat kiss on the lips of one of the players in the band, which led to intervention by the government of Malaysia and the closure of the series. And it shows that even in countries that are, we would say, rule of law countries that deal legally and correctly with contract disputes, when it comes to queer issues, they have oppression in their hearts. So, this is the world we live in, and there is no room for complacency, and there is a requirement for legal reform, but also social reform. And this is where we come to the surprise, because many of you will have seen in the Age newspaper, I saw in the Sydney Morning Herald, an op-ed that was written in May. And it was written by a young man in Melbourne, Australia. And he responded to news reports concerning the decision of the Presbyterian Church of Australia to insist that teachers must conform to the moral code taught by the Presbyterian Church, and they would never accept as a holder of student office anybody who was not complying with that moral course, and in particular they would not accept somebody who was gay. And this led a young Australian student at Melbourne Grammar School. You may have seen this. And he said, I am responding to this because I was so shocked by the course taken by the Presbyterian Church of Australia, and I feel I have to speak up. I myself am gay, and I am able to tell people that it's a matter supremely unimportant to people of his generation, but it's very important to others and to the world. And when I saw that, I thought, I can get a bit of relief from my speech to you in the Queer Lecture 2023 by inviting him to come here. He is the grandson of an alumnus of the Melbourne Law School, and he is the son of an alumnus of the Melbourne Law School. His father, Sean, is here today, and I acknowledge him and I honour him and I thank him for raising his son in such a way to be courageous. And I think his sister Olivia is here. I thank Olivia. Love of one's family is so important and sustains people to be strong and to be honest and to tell things as they are and not to go along with falsehood and unscientific points of view that are unworthy of leaders of certainly the Christian church. And that was a point that this young man, captain of Melbourne Grammar School, wrote in his op-ed. Now, all my education was in public schools. I'm a great advocate of public education. I'm not a real big lover of private education. But I have to say that Melbourne Grammar School has stood with Daniel Cash and has supported him entirely and knows that he is here today, and I have asked him to speak briefly to you of what led him to take this courageous step, because this is an indication of what is going to happen in our world as people get to know LGBT people and get to know how cruel and unscientific and ignorant the laws that we've had to put up since the 1200s, if not earlier. So can I invite Daniel Cash to come forward and be acknowledged? Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you for having me. I might begin by saying that I was very worried, as a person with something of an ego I've been accused of, that I would be overshadowed by this titan of the legal field, and I probably have, but I'm very proud to say that I can outdo you on one point, because the band in question is the 1975, not the 1965. Now, thank you again for the invitation, Justice Kirby, and those at Melbourne University. I've had the context given for my invitation today, but I'll say hello, happy to meet you all. My name is Danny. Justice Kirby asked me to give some thoughts on his thoughts. So I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants here because I had to be furiously taking notes, because this is kind of in extempore, but hopefully that means it's the most original it can be. And I wonder, being probably the youngest in this room, what I could possibly offer of value to you all, very bright, accomplished people. And I realised, thank God I realised, because I don't know what else I'd have spoken about, that the answer, alongside the answers to most other things, probably lies with history. We will need to face these challenges that Justice Kirby spoke about in the Caribbean, in Japan, in the subcontinent, in those horrible laws in Uganda and Brunei. To face those challenges, we will need courage. We will need vim, vitality, dynamism, compassion together. And it is, I think, to history that we can look to see men and women who, scores of them, yield up examples that I think we can follow and emulate, and that way find the courage to overcome these challenges that we face at home and abroad. Again, point of great fortune to me, I've been reading and listening about Oscar Wilde a bit lately. So I think tonight I'll speak, I've got 5 minutes, I won't go over.
Make it 7.
I think tonight I'll speak about 2 profiles in courage, and first I'll start with Oscar. And I encourage you to watch Stephen Fry on YouTube talk about Oscar Wilde as well. He speaks very eloquently, and I'll repeat one story, one anecdote that he speaks about. So Oscar was gay, was flamboyant, extravagant, very camp in the Victorian era. So a time when ladies fainted in Hyde Park, when hats were too tall, when showing ankle at a dinner party was treasonous. You spoke, I think, about Kraft von Ebbing, who I think, if I'm correct, I sound very smart right now, I think he wrote Psychopathia Sexualis in 1868, and that is the first recorded instance of the word homosexual in use. So Oscar lived for much of his life, he died in 1900, I think, he lived for much of his life in a time when these things, you know, Queen Victoria was known for not believing lesbians existed, or so the rumour goes. That is the time he lived in. So he died in social exile in France. His famous last words, as he looked contemptuously around the room, were, "Either the wallpaper goes or I do." And he had been sentenced before that to 2 years of hard labour for indecency or homosexuality. And the judge who tried him said it was the worst case he had ever come across, and he had tried a child murder case 2 weeks before. That is the kind of environment that Wilde lived in. And I mention him as a profile in courage because despite all this adversity, he was himself. He is revered by students of all fields, but namely literature and history and culture, because he was himself, was courageous, was in possession of that vim I think we can emulate. And the anecdote, I think, which really displays this is when men came to his apartment in London and they said, "Mr. Wilde, we have letters that you've written to Lord Alfred Douglas, your lover, and we have been offered money by the leading magazines to sell these, to publicise these. You'll be done." And indeed, that did happen. And Oscar's response was quite unexpected, as much of what he did was. He said, "How much have you been offered?" And I said, £50, which was a lot of money back then. And Oscar replied saying, "My God, £50. I have not ever been offered quite so much for a single piece of my prose work. You must go and sell them immediately." And they did, and it was the undoing of Oscar. There are so many stories like that about his life, and again, now that I've got 7 minutes, I still don't think I can go into them. But there is an example of someone who was themselves in a time much harder than it is today. And I think in finding the strength to battle against the adversity, in part which you spoke about, we can look to history in that fashion. Now, the second profile in courage, I think he would be offended if I said he was part of history. It's very much part of the present, Your Honour. Someone who has been openly gay in the judiciary for decades, someone who has fought for our cause for much of his lifetime so far, someone who has been a leading figure in Australia for the kind of thing that we're in this room today about. And to finish, I'm very glad I bought this book, because just as you outsourced some of your speech, I'll outsource some of it back by quoting the final paragraph. I'll just get there. And I'll tell you why I'm quoting this in a second. "If only I could go back to the botany lawn and look again at the old man of 30 enjoying the sunshine. If only I could film that extraordinary moment when 2 young men walked past the Al Alamein fountain in King's Cross and, finding no coffee shop open, repaired to the apartment in Kirby, never to be parted. If only AIDS had not come along, with its burdens and fearful challenges as such a terrifying ordeal for so many precious friends. If only we were still in Canberra, walking under a million stars in the clear night, contemplating the puzzles of justice that would arise on the morrow. If only the inexorable ticking of the clock could be stopped and the beauty of the present could be kept forever. If only I could learn to smell the roses." Now, I quote that final paragraph from Justice Kirby's autobiography because that is another profile in courage we can look to. A life of eloquence, an illustrious life, it's very intimidating. A life of meaning so far, of work done in the face of adversity, but for the cause of integrity. If you had any doubts, and this is what I hope to offer you tonight, if you had any doubts about how our world will fare with so many challenges stacked against it, I encourage you to look to history, to look to the men and women who number the pages of history, men like Oscar Wilde, men who exist in the present like Justice Kirby, and we can copy them. We can follow their example, for the hardest work I think has already been done. The support I received for my article was very lovely. Not much negativity at all. And I think really, though it came from a hard place, it's a cause for optimism. And I suppose that's my message tonight. Like I said, it's very nice to meet you all, and thank you again, Justice Kirby, for your words. Thank you.
You sit down there. Sit down. Now, wasn't that a lovely surprise for you? Wasn't that a good idea? And isn't he a wonderful symbol of the future? And I hope you've seen that, unprepared, we both came around to the same thing. We came around to the same message, that in all the grandeur of our work and our devotion to courts and justice and office and glory and honours and gongs, in the end, the things that really matter are our love for one another and our love for particular people who are so precious in our lives. Our parents, our grandparents, the people who have brought us up, our teachers, wonderful teachers, and our university friends. I think this is the message that I derive from Daniel's talk to us tonight, and I'm really proud that he came ultimately back to what I think is the most important thing. People have got to be told, stop being so cruel, stop being so unkind, stop being so unscientific, stop being so oppressive. And for those who don't stop, we've got to invoke the law, and the law has a role to play, and we as lawyers have a role to play. So I thank the Cash family, I thank the father, sister, and I thank Daniel, and looking at him, I have great faith in the future that things are going to get better for everybody, and certainly for LGBTIQ plus queer people. Okay, now that's so far. We now have a Q&A, and I'm very good at Q&A. Are you any good at? Yes, you'd be pretty good too.
For just one or two questions tonight, if anyone wants to, if anyone from the audience has a question.
No, you sit down.
I think you cover the fields, the two of you. Well, we've actually come to the end of the evening, and I think we like to thank everyone for attending tonight, and that brings us to the end of the Queer Annual Lecture of 2023.
What? It's not over. There's not been any Q&A. This is the Melbourne Law School. We are in one of the hotbeds of intellectual vibrancy in our country.
Oh, actually, we do have some
you.
questions from the audience. I probably should have looked to my right before wrapping up.
G'day, Justice Kirby. Thank you for presenting to us today. I think we can also agree it's wonderful to have you here. I'm going to preface this by saying that I realise I'm asking this to the man who's been dubbed the Great Dissenter. But we live in a common law system where, precedent plays a massive role in our interpretation of laws and past laws. How do you feel, and you're very well equipped to answer this, how do you feel the law is equipped to overcome that and progress forward where it otherwise is binding injustice. It has injustice entrenched into prior decisions.
Well, I never thought that I had the authority as a judge in the Australian legal system to just do what I thought was good and what I thought was fair and just. I never thought that. I never did that. But the law depends upon language, and language is ambiguous, and statute and the Constitution are ambiguous. And that's where the lesson from my teacher, Julius Stone, comes in, because he taught that where you have ambiguity, or where you have a gap, or where something is unclear, the judge of our tradition has a leeway for choice. They were his words. I think they were Radbrook's words, but they were a leeway for choice. And it has to be explained, it has to be justified, it has to be verbalised, but it's part of our system. Once Sir Anthony Mason was interrogated by a journalist about activist judges. This is a label, just as I think the great dissenter is a label. It's designed to disempower people from their proper influence. But Sir Anthony swept around in a typical dramatic lawyer's gesture at all the law books that were on the shelves behind him, and he said, "Where do you think the common law and its principles came from?" They came from activist judges who were developing the law. And why does the common law still operate in so many countries of the old British Empire? It's because it is a malleable, it's a flexible, it's a developing system. And that has been demonstrated by the Supreme Court of India in Johar against the Union of India, which is the case that struck down Section 377 in India. So that, in fact, is the challenge and the justification of lawyers of our tradition. We are very lucky to work in a system which is not rigid, which is not mechanical, but which can be adapted properly and justified by our independent, uncorrupted judges. So please don't think I, sitting up there in my eyrie in the High Court, thought I had the authority just to fix all the problems of the world up and make up my own mind. I never felt that. I always strove to explain and justify what I did. And being a dissenter is difficult. You've got to work harder. If you're an agreeer, all you do is send around a piece of paper that says, "I agree with Justice so-and-so." And then you go out and you play a game of golf and you have a very easy afternoon. Anyway, any other questions? A question for Daniel.
This is actually a question for both of you, so feel free, either of you, to take it. So you talk about injustice. Obviously, no country's perfect, Australia's not perfect, but you focused in on a few specific countries where homosexuality is still outlawed. I was wondering, again, for both of you, what you think the role of people in this room as Australians, future judges, future lawyers in Australia, is in resolving justice, not just in Australia, but around the whole world. What do you think our role is, and what do you think we can do beyond our borders to help correct this injustice?
Well, I think the answer to that question is demonstrated in recent statistics I saw from Hong Kong. This is Hong Kong today. And Hong Kong in 2013 had an opinion poll which said that 59% of the people of Hong Kong felt extremely uncomfortable about that there were homosexuals, and they didn't want to have them living near them, they didn't want to have anything to do with them, and they certainly disfavoured same-sex marriage. The criminal laws had been changed in Hong Kong as a parting gesture of the British colonial administration, but they were against it. But a poll conducted a week or so ago found that the percentage who feel uncomfortable has come down from 59% to 13%. So the lesson of all this is when people get to know gay people, and when they get to know they're just ordinary people with a desire for love, to be loved and to return love, and to have a peaceful and creative and productive life, and to have partners and special friends, that when they know that, it's very hard to hate them. When I was appointed to the High Court, I was confronted in our kitchen in Rose Bay in Sydney by Johan. He said, "How long do you think you're going to be around?" And I said, "Oh, well, my father's still alive." And he said, "We've got to stand up. This is the importance of a partner and of close friends. And we've got to stand up." So this is a very Netherlands conversation between an Anglo-Irish Australian, cautious and sort of looking over your shoulder and being correct and polite, and being bold, direct and honest. And my partner is bold, direct and honest. He said, "We've got to stand up. You've got to stand up. We've got to do this for young people." And so I said, "Very well, Johan." And this is why Daniel's steps are so much more important than mine. I mean, when young people get up and not only take a stand, but then write an op-ed. That's quite difficult. That's like writing a short High Court judgment and getting it into the media and getting it out there and saying that things are changing and people are changing. If they're changing in Hong Kong, they can change in Australia, and they can change in Botswana, and they can change in Belize, and they can change ultimately in Saudi Arabia and Malaysia. So, Daniel, do you want to say anything about that, the process of change? Because the question is actually quite important. How do we, it's one thing to change the law, and changing the law does appear to have an indirect and time-lapsed impact. But changing social attitudes, changing religious-based social attitudes, that's more difficult. But we've got to do what we can in Australia to help our neighbours. Penny Wong announced at the time of the big Pride conference in Sydney that the Australian government was giving millions of dollars to support LGBT movements throughout Asia, throughout the Pacific, our neighbours. And so that is a good thing, and we should be encouraging them to do that and to give more. How do we change people's attitude, Daniel? You have helped to change things by standing up and by writing your... and what has been the reaction amongst your schoolmates and the teachers at your school? Have they said, "Oh, you've ruined your career and you'll never..." I tell you, the time is close coming when it is almost compulsory to be LGBTIQ. And there will be plenty of jobs for LGBTIQ. Now, what's your reaction?
May that time come very quickly. The question, I think, and I understand I'm 17 years old, so I could be wrong here, and it's quite audacious of me to offer an answer, and thank you for the invitation too. But immediately, I think we should act with the caution of not working for people, but working with them. I think many countries, like the aforementioned, could perhaps view Australian and Western aid as imposing our moral systems on theirs, and thereby that can be somewhat alien. Do I look slim, Dad?
Go on.
But I believe that if we work with people instead of for them, we can hopefully make that sort of change. And I don't know how that works systematically, but agencies like UNICEF or DFAT or whatever, where you can actually work with people in countries instead of perhaps pontificating or moralising. I think also The statistic in Hong Kong, which you mentioned, is encouraging, and it shows also that with rises in literacy, rises in education, and with kind of cultural cohesion, the acceptance increases. And if we can help countries develop economically, that's a byproduct of that. But also, just by showing how it works in our country, by showing in a progressive, hopefully a progressive nation, how accepting queer people is actually good for the economy, good for the people, good for the wider social welfare, we can display, hopefully by example, that that's the way to go.
Did you get any pushback? Were there some students who you felt were shunning you or told that you that they really didn't think you should have done this and it brings disrespect to the school and so on? Did you get anything of that kind?
Luckily, I'm very tall and intimidating.
But yes, I wish I was.
But I promise you, I'm not lying. Not a single bit of bad feedback. Like, it's unrealistic, Your Honour. It's unrealistic. It has been such a cause for optimism. No negativity from my school, and in the feedback I've received from letters or emails or online, no negativity there either. There has been disagreement, which is fine, which is good, which is the privilege of a pluralistic society. People can think what they like and treat each other still with respect, but no negativity. A cause for optimism.
And is Melbourne Grammar, that's an Anglican school, isn't
Yes.
it? It's a big difference between the Sydney Anglicans, that's all I can say. Okay, any other questions? Right up the back. Speak up.
Yeah, I was just wondering, since both you, Justice, but also you, Daniel, have been interested to hear from someone who's lucky enough to not yet have a legal education. But would you say, when, say, you've got changes happening in countries to, bring about LGBT plus rights, would it be, do you have any preference in these changes being political and sort of happening through legislative means, or being more kind of legalistic changes related to rights and generally happening through the judiciary, or is it just as long as change happens, change happens?
Well, I would prefer changes to come through the democratic process. But my fellow Australians, we did not get land rights for Aboriginal Australians by the political process. It was done by 6 judges in Canberra who were never elected, but who were acting according to what they felt were the fundamental principles of the common law that had to be given effect where Parliament had held back. So my answer is, I'll take any. To get rid of irrational and stupid laws and cruel and oppressive laws, I think whatever is available in the country it should be used. And in India, I ask myself, would the Indian government of Mr. Modi, who is quite a conservative person, would that have done what the Justices of the Supreme Court of India did in Johar against Union of India? I don't think so. So in a constitutional democracy, there are a lot of players and they all have their role to play. And of course the legislature has the primary role to play, but the courts have their role to play. And it depends on the constitution and what it says, and on the imagination of lawyers and on the courage of lawyers. It's very important to say at this great law school, it depends on the courage of lawyers and their imagination to think up the way we can attain a more just society. What do you think is the answer?
So sorry, I think we're actually going to have to wrap up the lecture, otherwise you're going to miss your plane.
I'm just beginning to...
I'm terribly sorry.
Anyway,
Otherwise I'll have...
1 minute. Did we have a good exploration of a rather sad history which has had some good things happening, and they're continuing to happen, and we have to make them happen? And did we do well to have a young Australian who so rudely said, I'm probably the youngest person here, to come along and tell us how a new generation with new ideas, new thoughts, and with new courage, are going to help to change what has been so unjust and oppressive. And that should encourage us all to find in ourselves, as far as we can, courage and determination to change what is wrong. Equal justice under law. Thank you all very much. Thank you.